But their problem today is they have a president who continued to commit crimes today, at least in the assessment of the chairman of this committee, which means he's going to act on this. It's going to be the headline tomorrow morning in all the major papers, top of the fold, right hand. The major story is going to be Trump accused of witness tampering yesterday.
So I don't know if our cameras can zoom in on this, but the front page of the Wall Street Journal, which is of the three national newspapers, one that Donald Trump seems to like the most, to the degree that real news gets in front of him at all. I think this is the real news he prefers. The three headlines today: federal prosecutors probe Rudy Giuliani's links to Ukrainian energy projects. Underneath that, Roger Stone, Donald Trump's longest-serving political counselor, found guilty of lying to Congress and witness tampering. And then in the right-hand corner of the story, Chris Matthews talking about Donald Trump attacks ex-envoy Yovanovitch as she testifies in the impeachment probe. This is today's live homepage of the Wall Street Journal.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.